Dr. Newman here with History of the English Language. Welcome back. Today we're talking about modern English in Great Britain and Ireland. We're going to look at developments in the language across the pond over the last couple hundred years. In the next video, we're going to talk about English around the world outside of the US and Britain. But in this one, we're talking about Britain and Ireland. And we're going to talk a little bit more first about the context, the historical changes that affected the English language as it developed. You can see many of them in this picture here. Advertisement, mass media, modern transportation, urbanization, all of these are some of the contexts that affected some of the important changes in the language over the last couple hundred years. These changes include political and social changes, technological and scientific changes, which resulted in changes in communication and transportation, and also the effects of ongoing war and empire. Britain has been involved in many, many wars since the American Revolution. I started making a list. We'll talk about that in the next slide, though. I think we're just going to talk when we talk more about the British Empire itself, or in this one. I'm not sure. Side by side, okay. Here's a picture from World War I of the sort of allegorical representations of the U.S. and the U.K. Obviously, after tension in the 19th century between the two countries, they became allies in the 20th centuries, although, as George Bernard Shaw famously put it, two nations divided by a common language. Here's a poster, by the way, from World War I of Lord Kitchener trying to recruit soldiers. This is the one that our U.S., the famous Uncle Sam, your country wants you poster was based on. So some of the social and political changes that took place in Britain, especially in the 19th century, one thing that went on was democratization. The Great Reform Act of 1832 expanded the vote and got rid of what were called the rotten boroughs. And then there were a number of subsequent acts that expanded the franchise, that is the right to vote, to more and more people. Originally, you had to be, own property of a certain amount, and you had to be a white man, and so on and so forth. But that in 1918, the franchise was extended to women of the age of 30. And then in 1929, that was lowered to 20, which was the same as the voting age for men. So more and more people were able to participate in the political process. At the same time, there were educational reforms. In 1870, universal compulsory education was established in England, as with the establishment of state schools, school boards, and local education authorities. As a result, literacy rates skyrocket. And so more and more people were interested in reading things like the Illustrated Police News, an incredibly successful newspaper in the 19th century London. As you can see, true crime has been with us as a genre for a very long time. There's something about it that just appeals to our lizard brains. Another big factors and changes, of course, were the Napoleonic Wars first, and then the Imperial Wars of the 19th century and the World Wars of the 20th century, which resulted in mass mobilization, which involved people of different classes and regions mixing with each other more, as well as the development of more and more greater elaboration of the administrative state to run this empire and these massive war efforts, in parallel to what happened in the United States, especially subsequent to the Civil War. Though to earlier and to a greater extent in Britain when it was still a larger, richer, and more powerful country. Technological and scientific changes were also important in the 19th century as well as the 20th century. Of course, Britain is where the Industrial Revolution began. And this is too big a subject. I'm not going to go into it. I encourage you to learn more about it. But another big sort of factor in the 19th century in Britain is what's sometimes been called the Victorian Enlightenment, which is a period of great scientific and cultural production in Britain in the 19th century. An efflorescence of culture and learning that included the works of Charles Dickens, Darwin, John Stuart Mill, Ada Lovelace, who was one of the inventors along with Charles Babbage of computer programming and digital computing, Michael Faraday, who made incredibly important progress in discovering the properties of electricity, which made electrification possible, and Florence Nightingale, who invented, in a lot of ways, the modern discipline of nursing. The communications was a big, there were big changes in communications and communications technologies. Before the 19th century, there were letters, there were town criers, there was word of mouth. And there was the printing press, but the printing press got a big goose in the 19th century with its industrial development. This here in the bottom right corner is a steam-powered printing press, which could, before that you had to hand press things, so you could only print things as quickly as somebody could just actually operate the press by hand. When you can suddenly print hundreds of thousands of newspapers in a few hours, this is an important cultural change that goes hand in hand, in fact, with the rise in mass literacy. So you have more stuff to read and more people who can read them. Other factors or other developments in communications technologies are, of course, the telegraph, the telephone, going into the 20th century, the radio. But another important factor of communication in the 19th century was the development of cheap postage and an incredibly reliable and dense mail system, especially in Britain. In Britain in the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, mail was being delivered 5 times a day in London. So the postal service was incredibly efficient and reliable. And of course, people's words could move around, and people themselves could move around more easily too through the development of canals, railroads, subways. The first subway was built in Glasgow in the middle of the 19th century in Scotland, but also steamships, trams, and also suspension bridges and tunnels, toll roads. Everything we think of as modern infrastructure really begins in the 19th century, which is when the modern world begins, and everything kind of speeds up, gets faster, globalization gets underway. And this is, of course, globalization is also accelerated by imperialism. In the 19th century, of course, I had a much longer list, and I ended up condensing them. We have Britain fighting in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, many Irish rebellions, Indian rebellions, as you can see, India here is part of the British Empire, African rebellions of the Dosa, the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Boers, and many more. Against the U.S., there was, of course, the War of 1812, and during the Civil War, Britain was actually making money by trading with both sides of the Civil War. They would have been very happy, I think, at the time to see America divided, because that would have made them less powerful relative to their own position. There were also wars with China, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and Burma. There's been very few places in this world that the UK has not been at war with or sent troops to at some point or other. And, we're just a chip off the old block, I guess. In the 20th century, of course, there's also been the First World War, the Russian Civil War, the Second World War, more imperial wars up through the 50s, such as the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. Britain has also been involved in many of the wars that the U.S. has been in the 20th century, including the Korean War, the Gulf War, the Bosnian War, the Kosovo War. They also had their own little war against Argentina in the early 1980s in order to maintain their control of the Falkland Islands. According to the comedian Eddie Izzard, these were needed for strategic sheep purposes. And this also made for, in the early 80s, a number of publications punning on The Empire Strikes Back. Anyway, Britain, of course, has also been involved in the global war on terror, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Basra was occupied largely by British troops during the Iraq War. Does anybody remember the Iraq War? All right. So as a result of all this movement, people being driven off land by the intensification of industrial agriculture, the development of factories and the concentration of these rootless workers in cities, movement around of people, communication, and universal publication, we got a reduction in regional dialect differences that resulted in a process that has sometimes been called Koinezation. That's it. Koinezation, which is dialect leveling and merging. That is, a common speech emerges through the kind of mixture and exchange of people speaking a number of different dialects. It's from the Greek word koine, which means common. And koine was the kind of Greek that was the common language of the Greeks from the close of the classical period to the Byzantine era. Koine Greek is, of course, what the New Testament is written in. A process of semantic generalization happens where a common language is shared by various people, a lingua franca. This is what a koine is. But a koine, unlike a lingua franca, refers to a colloquial register of everyday speech, whereas a lingua franca is an elite register spoken by like an international superclass. So like in early modern Europe, French was a lingua franca of European courts, but only among the aristocracy. It wasn't like people all across Europe were speaking, like if they could just travel and speak French with each other. A koine is a language that common people speak and share in common with people of other parts and regions. So the English language in England, differences between different regions and dialects are greatly reduced during this period as a result of all of these efforts. People circulate, words circulate because of the cheap newspaper with the steam press, cheap postage, the telegraph, the railroad and steamboat, and also in the 20th century, the development of the automobile, film, and broadcasting. Here's a music hall in the 19th century at Oxford, which was a form of entertainment, a kind of variety show, similar to the American vaudeville theater, where people of all classes and parts would mix with each other. I think I'm going to start a new video now. The second video will talk about the dialectical and accent differences in regions of Britain that do remain now that we've sort of talked about what happened to the English language and what the major factors were in reducing these differences between 1800 and 2000. Thanks for listening and join me for the next one. Bye.